New York Police Department files declassified in 2018 revealed disturbing details about an incident that occurred on June 7, 1935, at the Cotton Club. Over 72 hours, 7 men died under circumstances ranging from traffic accident to drowning in the East River, all officially unrelated. But forensic analysis of police reports, cross-referenced with survivor testimonies and hospital records, reveals a meticulous pattern of calculated retribution that began with a single racial insult at the door of Harlem's most famous club. Case file number 007 decodes Bumpy Johnson's response to a violation of his most fundamental code, respect for the dignity of the black community. This case study demonstrates how one man transformed public humiliation into a demonstration of power, using surgical precision instead of uncontrolled rage, and how 7 apparently disconnected deaths actually formed a strategic message that would echo through New York's underworld for decades. The analysis reveals not only Bumpy Johnson's methods, but the principles of proportionality, poetic symmetry, and information warfare that made him Harlem's most feared strategist. To understand what happened in those 72 hours, we must first understand the Cotton Club itself. Located at 142 West 142nd Street, the Cotton Club was Harlem's most notorious paradox. Black performers entertained exclusively white audiences in a venue owned by the mob and protected by corrupt police. Duke Ellington's orchestra played there. Cab Calloway sang there. Lena Horne danced there. But if you were black and not performing, you could not enter through the front door. This was the cruel mathematics of Harlem in 1935. Black excellence on display. Black dignity at the door denied. The year 1935 represented a critical moment in Harlem's evolution. The Great Depression had devastated the neighborhood. Unemployment among black workers reached 70%. The numbers racket, an illegal lottery system, provided one of the few economic opportunities available to the community. Bumpy Johnson, at age 30, had recently emerged from his first major conflict with Dutch Schultz, and was consolidating power in partnership with Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary numbers queen of Harlem. Together, they controlled approximately 60% of the policy game north of 110th Street, generating an estimated $100,000 weekly. But money was never the only currency that mattered to Bumpy Johnson. Respect was. The Cotton Club operated under the protection of Oni Madden, one of New York's most powerful bootleggers and mob figures. Madden had purchased the club in 1923 and transformed it into a gold mine by exploiting a simple formula. Showcase black talent to white audiences willing to pay premium prices for the exotic thrill of slumming in Harlem. The doormen who controlled access to the Cotton Club wielded enormous power. They decided who entered and who did not. They collected bribes. They reported to mob bosses. And in June of 1935, the head doorman was a man named Vincent "Vinnie" Calabrese. Vinnie Calabrese was 42 years old, 5 feet 11 inches tall, 210 pounds of muscle and meanness. He had worked for Oni Madden since 1928, first as an enforcer, then as the Cotton Club's head of security. Calabrese was known for 3 things: his loyalty to Madden, his hatred of black people, and his willingness to use violence to maintain what he called order. Police records show 17 complaints filed against Calabrese for assault between 1930 and 1935. None resulted in charges. Madden's protection extended far beyond the club itself. Bumpy Johnson, in June of 1935, was not yet the legend he would become, but he was already a force. Born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1905, he had arrived in Harlem at age 15 after witnessing violence that shaped his worldview forever. He was a voracious reader, particularly of military strategy and philosophy. He preferred intelligence to violence, but when violence became necessary, he applied it with surgical precision. By 1935, he had survived 2 assassination attempts, served 1 prison sentence, and established himself as Madame St. Clair's most trusted lieutenant and strategic mind. What made Bumpy different from other enforcers was his code. He refused to allow drugs in the neighborhoods he controlled. He ensured that numbers runners paid out winnings honestly. He protected elderly residents from robbery. He funded funerals for families who could not afford them. This was not altruism, it was strategy. A protected community was a loyal community. A loyal community provided intelligence, shelter, and support. Bumpy understood that in a world where the police would not protect black lives, the community needed someone who would. That role came with responsibilities he took seriously. Among those responsibilities was maintaining dignity. Bumpy Johnson would tolerate many things: competition, negotiation, even temporary defeat if it served a larger strategy. But he would not tolerate public disrespect of the black community. This was not emotional, this was strategic. Allow one insult to stand unchallenged and others would follow. Respect was the foundation of power, and power was the only thing that kept his community safe. On the evening of June 7th, 1935, at approximately 10:45 in the evening, Bumpy Johnson arrived at the Cotton Club with 4 companions. The group included Junie Bird, one of his most trusted bodyguards, 2 numbers runners named Luther Hayes and Clarence "Bub" Mitchell, and a young woman named Dorothy Reed, a singer who performed at smaller clubs in Harlem and who Bumpy was quietly dating. They arrived in 2 cars, parked on 142nd Street, and approached the main entrance. This was unusual. Bumpy rarely patronized establishments that excluded black customers. But Dorothy had never seen the Cotton Club's famous shows, and Bumpy had arranged through intermediaries for their entry. Money had changed hands. Permissions had been granted, or so Bumpy believed. Vincent Calabrese was standing at the velvet rope when Bumpy's group approached. The night was warm, humid, typical of early June in New York. The sound of Duke Ellington's orchestra drifted from inside the club, muffled but unmistakable. White patrons in evening wear moved past Calabrese with barely a glance. Then Bumpy Johnson, dressed in an immaculate dark suit, reached the rope. What happened next was witnessed by at least 12 people, including 2 off-duty police officers who were entering the club. Calabrese looked at Bumpy and his companions, then spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "We don't serve monkeys here. Take your jungle friends and get back to your side of town before I have you arrested for loitering." The street went quiet. Duke Ellington's muted trumpet filled the silence. Bumpy Johnson stood absolutely still. Witnesses later reported that his expression did not change. He did not raise his voice. He did not make threats. He simply looked at Vincent Calabrese for approximately 10 seconds, then turned and walked away. His companions followed. They got into their cars and drove north into Harlem without a word. This is where most stories of street violence would include rage, immediate retaliation, guns drawn in the moment. But Bumpy Johnson was not most men. As he drove away from the Cotton Club that night, his mind was not consumed with anger. It was calculating. Calabrese had not simply insulted Bumpy personally. He had insulted Dorothy Reed. He had insulted Junie Bird, Luther Hayes, and Bub Mitchell. He had done so publicly, in front of white witnesses who would spread the story, and black witnesses who needed to see how such insults were answered. The incident was a test. Bumpy's response would be a lesson. By 11:30 that evening, Bumpy was sitting in the back room of a speakeasy on Lenox Avenue, a place called The Nest that served as his informal headquarters. Junie Bird sat across from him. Dorothy Reed had gone home, humiliated and angry. Bumpy had said little during the drive back to Harlem, but now he spoke. "I want to know everything about Vincent Calabrese. where he lives, where he drinks, who he loves, who he owes. I want to know his routine down to the minute, and I want to know who else was working the door tonight, who heard what he said, and who laughed." Junie Bird nodded. This was not a request for vengeance. This was the beginning of an intelligence operation. Bumpy's network in Harlem was extensive. Within hours, information began flowing back. Calabrese lived in a fourth-floor walk-up apartment on Arthur Avenue in the Bronx. He was married with 2 children, ages 8 and 11. He drank at a bar called Moretti's on 187th Street every Tuesday and Thursday night. He gambled on horses and owed approximately $800 to a bookmaker named Sal Torino. He had a girlfriend, a showgirl named Angela Romano, whom he visited every Friday afternoon at her apartment on Mulberry Street in Little Italy. He reported directly to Oni Madden's lieutenant, a man named Eddie the Fixer Malone. But Bumpy wanted more than personal information. He wanted to understand the structure. Who else worked at the Cotton Club's door? 6 other doormen rotated shifts. Who were they? 4 Italians, 2 Irish. All connected to Madden's organization. Which ones had been present during the incident? 3, which ones had laughed at Calabrese's insult? 2, their names Rocco DeLuca and Patrick Paddy Sullivan. Did any of them have vulnerabilities? All of them had vulnerabilities. Crime creates debts, and debts create leverage. By 2 in the morning on June 8th, Bumpy had assembled a profile not just of Vincent Calabrese, but of the entire Cotton Club security apparatus. He understood the hierarchy, the relationships, the money flows, and the weak points. Now he needed to decide on the method. Killing Calabrese alone would send a message, but it would be incomplete. The insult had been public. The response needed to be public as well, but carefully calibrated. Too much violence would bring heat from the police and the mob. Too little would suggest weakness. The response needed to demonstrate power, precision, and inevitability. Bumpy spent June 8th and 9th conducting reconnaissance. He did not participate directly. Instead, he sent trusted observers to track Calabrese's movements, to photograph locations, to map routes and schedules. Bumpy was building what modern strategists would call a targeting package. Every decision would be informed by intelligence, not emotion. This was the difference between a street thug and a strategic thinker. Thugs reacted. Strategists orchestrated. On the morning of June 10th, Bumpy called a meeting at the Nest. Present were Junie Bird, Bob Mitchell, and 3 other men who formed Bumpy's inner circle. A numbers runner named Willie Slim Carter, who was brilliant with logistics. A former boxer named Leon the Hammer Jackson, who handled enforcement, and a quiet man named Thomas Reed, no relation to Dorothy, who had once worked as a clerk in the district attorney's office and understood legal pressure points better than anyone Bumpy knew. Bumpy laid out the situation methodically. He described the insult. He shared the intelligence gathered. Then he presented his plan. 7 men would face consequences. Calabrese himself was the primary target, but the 2 doormen who had laughed, DeLuca and Sullivan, would also answer. 4 additional targets were strategic. Eddie Malone, who supervised the Cotton Club security and therefore bore responsibility for Calabrese's conduct. Sal Torino, the bookmaker, because removing him would destabilize Calabrese psychologically before the final move. And 2 beat cops who regularly took bribes from the Cotton Club to ignore violations. Officers Daniel Murphy and Frank Russo. These cops had been present when Calabrese insulted Bumpy and had done nothing. In Bumpy's calculation, they were complicit. The number 7 was not accidental. In the cultural context of Harlem in 1935, 7 was a number with weight. 7 days of creation, 7 deadly sins, 7 as completion. Bumpy was creating a parable, and parables require symbolism. Each death would be different, each would carry meaning. Together they would form a message that everyone from Oni Madden to the lowest street hustler would understand. There are lines you do not cross. The plan required patience. Bumpy did not want the deaths clustered closely enough to appear obviously connected, but spread thinly enough to lose impact. 72 hours was the window, 3 days, the symbolic echo of resurrection, of transformation, of judgment from Friday night to Monday night. By Tuesday morning the message would be complete. Bumpy assigned each target to specific members of his crew based on capability and poetic symmetry. This was crucial to his method. Each punishment would reflect the crime. Calabresi, who had called them monkeys and threatened arrest, would die in a way that stripped his dignity and mocked authority. DeLuca and Sullivan, who had laughed, would die in moments of vulnerability when they expected safety. Malone, who profited from the club's racism, would lose his profits in a way that destroyed his reputation. Torino would lose the thing he loved most. The two corrupt cops would face a reckoning that exposed their corruption. On Friday, June 7th, at 11:59 in the evening, just over an hour after the insult, Bumpy Johnson made a phone call from the Nest to a contact in the Bronx. The message was simple. It begins Monday. Make sure everyone is ready. The countdown had started. What Bumpy understood, and what made him exceptional, was that effective retribution is not about satisfying personal anger. It is about communication. Every act of violence sends a message to multiple audiences simultaneously. To enemies, it demonstrates capability and resolve. To allies, it demonstrates loyalty and protection. To the community, it demonstrates that dignity will be defended. To authorities, it demonstrates limits and calculations. Bumpy was about to send 7 messages, each tailored to a specific recipient, each part of a larger statement. Monday, June 10th, 1935, began with rain. Summer rain in New York City, warm and heavy, turning streets into rivers and forcing pedestrians under awnings. At 6:30 in the morning, Sal Torino left his apartment on Mulberry Street and walked 3 blocks to his usual coffee shop. Torino was 48 years old, a bookmaker who operated out of a social club in Little Italy. He took bets on horses, boxing matches, and baseball games. He was moderately successful, moderately connected, and moderately cautious. But on this particular Monday morning, Sal Torino was thinking about the $800 Vincent Calabresi owed him and wondering when he would collect. Torino never made it to the coffee shop. As he crossed the intersection of Mulberry and Grand, a black Packard sedan ran the red light and struck him at approximately 30 miles per hour. Witnesses reported hearing the impact from half a block away. Torino's body flew 15 feet and hit the pavement with catastrophic force. The Packard did not stop. It turned east onto Grand Street and disappeared. Police arrived within minutes. An ambulance followed. Sal Torino was pronounced dead at the scene. The official cause of death: hit and run, driver unknown. The investigation, such as it was, concluded within a week with no arrests. But the accident was no accident. The driver was Willie "Slim" Carter, one of Bumpy's logistics specialists. The Packard had been stolen 3 days earlier from a parking garage in Queens, repainted and fitted with false license plates. Carter had studied Torino's Monday morning routine for 2 weeks. He knew the route, the timing, the intersection. The hit was executed with precision, designed to appear opportunistic while being entirely calculated. Torino's death served multiple purposes. It eliminated Calabresi's primary creditor, creating immediate financial relief that would later be weaponized psychologically. It demonstrated Bumpy's reach beyond Harlem into Little Italy itself. And it sent a message to other bookmakers: the protection you think you have is conditional. At 2:15 that same afternoon, Officer Daniel Murphy was sitting in his patrol car on West 145th Street, eating a sandwich and reading the racing form. Murphy was 36 years old, 15 years on the force, thoroughly corrupt. He collected weekly payments from the Cotton Club, 3 speakeasies, 2 brothels, and a numbers operation that competed with Bumpy's. He had been standing outside the Cotton Club on Friday night when Calabrese insulted Bumpy Johnson. He had seen the entire incident and had done nothing, which was exactly what the mob paid him to do. A young black boy, perhaps 12 years old, approached Murphy's patrol car and knocked on the window. Murphy looked annoyed but rolled down the window. The boy said, "Officer, there's a man hurt bad in the alley behind the Apollo. He's bleeding real bad. Please help." Murphy, motivated more by the potential for a bribe than genuine concern, put down his sandwich and followed the boy east toward the Apollo Theater on 125th Street. The alley behind the Apollo was narrow, dark even in mid-afternoon, filled with trash cans and the smell of rotting food. Murphy entered cautiously, his hand on his service revolver. He saw no injured man. He turned to ask the boy what was happening, but the boy had vanished. Then Murphy heard a voice from deeper in the alley. "Officer Murphy, we need to talk." Leon the Hammer. Jackson stepped from behind a dumpster. Jackson was 6 feet 2 inches tall, 240 pounds, a former heavyweight boxer who had fought professionally until a detached retina ended his career. His hands were legendary in Harlem, fast, heavy, devastating. Murphy recognized him immediately and reached for his gun. He never cleared the holster. Jackson moved with speed that seemed impossible for a man his size. One punch to Murphy's solar plexus folded him in half. A second punch, a precise uppercut, snapped his head back and rendered him unconscious. What happened next was methodical. Jackson dragged Murphy deeper into the alley, propped him against a wall, and removed every dollar from his wallet, every piece of identification, his badge, his gun, and his watch. Then Jackson did something that would become part of Harlem folklore. He took a knife and carefully cut away Murphy's uniform, leaving him in his undergarments. He placed all the stolen items, badge, gun, money, identification, in a neat pile next to Murphy's unconscious body. Then he walked away. Murphy regained consciousness approximately 20 minutes later. He was found by 2 pedestrians, half naked in an alley, his possessions stolen, his dignity obliterated. The official police report described it as a robbery, but everyone who mattered understood the real message. Murphy had been stripped of authority, of respect, of the very uniform that gave him power. The symmetry was perfect. He had stood by while Calabrese stripped Bumpy of dignity. Now Murphy understood how that felt. Murphy never filed charges. He could not explain why he had followed a child into an alley. He could not admit he had been overpowered so easily. He could not acknowledge that this was punishment, not random crime. Within 3 months, Murphy transferred to a precinct in Staten Island and left Harlem forever. But Bumpy Johnson was not finished. At 7:45 Monday evening, Rocco DeLuca was drinking at a bar on Mott Street in Little Italy, celebrating a profitable night at the Cotton Club. DeLuca was 29 years old, muscle for hire, a doorman who supplemented his income through petty theft and intimidation. He had been one of the men who laughed when Calabrese insulted Bumpy. Now he was on his 4th whiskey, telling the story to his friends and laughing again. Thomas Reed sat 3 stools down, nursing a beer and listening. Reed was Bumpy's quiet weapon, the man who gathered information while appearing harmless. He was 42 years old, thin, bespectacled, a former law clerk who had lost his job during the Depression and found employment with Madame Saint. Claire organizing the numbers racket's financial records, Reed had a gift for blending into any environment. At Moretti's bar, he looked like a tired clerk, unwinding after work. No one noticed him. No one ever noticed Thomas Reed. DeLuca finished his drink and stood to leave. He was drunk but functional, walking steadily as he exited the bar and headed north toward his apartment 6 blocks away. Reed followed at a distance. At the corner of Mott and Hester, DeLuca turned into a narrow side street that cut through to Mulberry. Reed accelerated slightly, closing the distance. When DeLuca was halfway down the block, Reed called out, "Hey, Rocco, got a light?" DeLuca turned. He saw a thin man in glasses, harmless-looking, holding an unlit cigarette. DeLuca reached into his pocket for matches. Reed moved close, as if to shield the flame from the wind. Then, with practiced efficiency, Reed withdrew a switchblade from his jacket and drove it upward into DeLuca's abdomen just below the ribcage. The blade was 7 inches long and razor-sharp. It penetrated cleanly, seeking the kidney with anatomical precision. DeLuca gasped. His eyes went wide. Reed held him upright, still appearing to anyone at a distance, like two men sharing a light. He leaned close and whispered, "You laughed at the wrong man." Then he withdrew the blade, stepped back, and let DeLuca collapse. Reed walked away at a normal pace, turned the corner onto Mulberry Street, and disappeared. DeLuca bled out in approximately 8 minutes. A passerby found his body at 8:15. Police investigated. No witnesses, no suspects. Another unsolved stabbing in Little Italy, where such things happened. But the method was the message. DeLuca had laughed, finding amusement in another man's humiliation. His last moments were not amusing. Reed had chosen a wound that was fatal but slow, ensuring DeLuca understood he was dying and why. This was not rage. This was curriculum. By Monday night, 3 men were dead or destroyed. Sal Torino, killed by a car. Officer Murphy, stripped and humiliated. Rocco DeLuca, stabbed in the street. None appeared connected. The deaths occurred in different neighborhoods, by different methods, with no obvious pattern. This was intentional. Bumpy wanted confusion initially, followed by understanding. The confusion would prevent immediate retaliation. The understanding, when it came, would be more powerful. Tuesday, June 11th, brought no rain. The sun rose over New York at 5:42 in the morning, bright and hot, promising a sweltering day. At 6:30, Patrick "Paddy" Sullivan was eating breakfast in his kitchen in Hell's Kitchen. Sullivan was 34, another Cotton Club doorman, another man who had laughed on Friday night. He was married with 1 child, a daughter aged 6. Sullivan considered himself a family man who just happened to work for the mob. Like most men who rationalize evil, he had convinced himself that small complicity was not really complicity at all. At 6:55, there was a knock at Sullivan's door. His wife was in the bedroom dressing their daughter for school. Sullivan opened the door without checking, expecting a neighbor. Instead, he found Junie Bird holding a revolver equipped with a homemade suppressor, a crude device made from steel wool and oil filters, illegal but effective. Before Sullivan could react, Bird shot him twice in the chest. The suppressor reduced the gunshots to loud coughs, not enough to alert neighbors immediately. Sullivan fell backward into his apartment. Bird stepped inside, closed the door, and walked away. Sullivan's wife found him 3 minutes later. She screamed. Neighbors called police. An investigation opened, but Junie Bird had worn gloves, left no evidence, and vanished into the morning crowds of Hell's Kitchen within seconds. The official conclusion: home invasion, possibly mistaken identity. But only Madden's people knew better. Someone was targeting Cotton Club employees. The question was, who and why? At 11:30 Tuesday morning, Eddie the Fixer Malone was sitting in his office at a warehouse on 10th Avenue, reviewing accounts for Madden's various operations. Malone was 51 years old, a mob accountant who had risen through loyalty and competence. He managed the Cotton Club's finances, ensured bribes were paid, handled labor disputes, and occasionally ordered violence when business required it. He was responsible for hiring and supervising all Cotton Club security personnel, including Vincent Calabresi. That made him responsible, in Bumpy's calculation, for Friday night's insult. Malone's phone rang. The caller identified himself as a representative of the New York State Tax Authority Audit Division. The man said there were irregularities in the Cotton Club's tax filings and requested Malone's presence at the tax office downtown for an interview. Malone, annoyed but compliant, agreed to appear at 2 o'clock that afternoon. He hung up and cursed. Tax audits were expensive, time-consuming, and dangerous. They invited scrutiny that could unravel entire operations. The call was not from the tax authority, it was from Thomas Reed, using documents and letterhead he had acquired during his time in the district attorney's office. Reed had studied Malone's patterns and identified his greatest vulnerability, reputation. Malone's value to Madden rested on his ability to keep operations clean and profitable. A tax investigation threatened both. At 1:45, Malone arrived at the address Reed had provided, an office building on Center Street near City Hall. He took the elevator to the 7th floor and entered Suite 712. The office was real. Reed had rented it for a week using a false name. Inside, Reed sat behind a desk wearing a suit, surrounded by fabricated documents. He looked every part the bureaucrat. Malone sat down, prepared to negotiate. Reed began asking questions about the Cotton Club's revenue, expenses, and employee payments. Malone answered carefully, revealing nothing incriminating. Then Reed shifted the conversation. He pulled out a folder and said, "We have evidence that you have been skimming from your employer, Mr. Malone. Approximately $50,000 over the past 2 years. We are prepared to notify Mr. Madden and the relevant authorities unless you cooperate with our investigation." Malone went pale. The accusation was false, but it was plausible, and that was enough. In the mob, accusations of theft carried death sentences. Malone stammered denials. Reed remained calm, professional, bureaucratic. He told Malone that if he signed a confession and agreed to testify against Madden, the tax authority would offer protection. Otherwise, the evidence would be forwarded to Madden within 24 hours. Malone refused to sign. He stood angry and terrified and left the office. But the damage was complete. Malone spent Tuesday afternoon in a panic, trying to determine if the meeting was real, if Madden had heard rumors, if his position was secure. By Tuesday evening, his judgment was compromised. At 8:30, he met with Madden to preemptively deny any embezzlement. Madden, suspicious by nature, began asking questions. Within days, Malone's relationships fractured. Within weeks, he was demoted. Within months, he left New York entirely. The tax investigation never materialized because it never existed. But Malone's career died on Tuesday afternoon in that fake office. Reed had destroyed him without firing a shot. Officer Frank Russo was the 5th target. Russo was 41 years old, 17 years on the force, more deeply corrupt than Murphy. He collected protection money from 6 locations in Harlem, including the Cotton Club. He had been outside the club Friday night and had smiled when Calabrese insulted Bumpy. Now it was Tuesday evening, and Russo was sitting in his patrol car on St. Nicholas Avenue, counting the week's bribe money. At 8:45, Russo's car window shattered. A brick wrapped in paper crashed through the glass and landed in his lap. Russo, startled, looked up to see no one on the street. He unwrapped the brick carefully. Inside was a note typed on clean white paper. "We know where you live. We know where your daughter goes to school. We know everything. Stop collecting in Harlem, or your family pays." Attached to the note were photographs. Russo's home in the Bronx, his 13-year-old daughter walking to school, his wife shopping at the market. The message was clear. The threat was credible. Russo never discovered who sent the note. Leon Jackson had taken the photographs. Thomas Reed had written and typed the message. Bub Mitchell had thrown the brick. But Russo did not need to know identities. He needed to know consequences. By Wednesday morning, Russo had requested a transfer to a different precinct. By the following week, he stopped collecting in Harlem. By the end of June, he avoided Harlem entirely. He was not dead, but his influence was. Now 5 of 7 targets had been addressed. Sal Torino was dead. Rocco DeLuca was dead. Paddy Sullivan was dead. Eddie Malone was destroyed professionally. Officer Murphy was humiliated. Officer Russo was terrified. The pattern was becoming visible. Only Madden's people were connecting the dots. Someone was systematically dismantling the network around the Cotton Club, but they did not yet understand why. Wednesday, June 12th, was the final day. 2 targets remained. The last would be Vincent Calabrese himself, but first came a message for those who might seek revenge. At 10 in the morning, a package was delivered to Oni Madden's office at the Cotton Club. Inside was a single item, Vincent Calabrese's wallet. It contained his identification, $300 in cash, and a photograph of his children. Attached was a note, handwritten in elegant script. Some debts can only be paid one way. Justice comes for those who deny dignity. It was unsigned. Madden understood immediately. This was not robbery. This was a declaration. Someone had Calabrese's wallet, which meant someone had access to Calabrese. The implication was clear. Madden called his lieutenants and ordered them to find Calabrese and bring him to safety. But Calabrese was already gone. At 8:30 Wednesday morning, Vincent Calabrese had left his apartment in the Bronx to meet his girlfriend, Angela Romano, at her apartment in Little Italy. This was his routine every Wednesday. He took the subway, a 20-minute ride, and walked 3 blocks to Angela's building. He arrived at 9:05 and used his key to enter. Angela was waiting in the kitchen. Calabrese kissed her and asked if she had made coffee. She said yes and poured him a cup. What Calabrese did not know was that Angela Romano was terrified. On Tuesday night, a man had visited her apartment. The man was polite, calm, and utterly frightening. He had asked Angela if she loved Vincent Calabrese. She had said no, which was true. Their relationship was transactional. The man had explained that Calabrese was going to die and that Angela could choose to be present or absent when it happened. If she cooperated, she would be unharmed and compensated. If she refused, she would share his fate. He showed her photographs of Calabrese's wife and children to demonstrate the precision of his knowledge. Then he gave her $500 in cash and instructions. Angela, a survivor above all else, agreed. Wednesday morning, Angela made coffee as instructed. She poured Calabrese a cup. She excused herself to use the bathroom, and she left the apartment through the back entrance. As she had been told to do, Calabrese sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee, wondering why Angela was taking so long. Then the front door opened. Bumpy Johnson entered Angela Romano's apartment at 9:27 in the morning. He was alone. He was unarmed. He wore the same dark suit he had worn Friday night at the Cotton Club. Vincent Calabrese looked up and recognized him immediately. The coffee cup slipped from his hands and shattered on the floor. Calabrese reached for the gun he kept in his jacket pocket. Bumpy raised one hand calmly and said, "You can draw that gun and die with it in your hand, or you can sit still and understand why you're dying. Your choice." Calabrese's hand hovered over his pocket. Then slowly, he withdrew it and placed both hands on the table. Bumpy walked forward until he stood directly across from Calabrese. The kitchen was small, intimate. Morning light streamed through the window. Somewhere below, a vendor was selling fruit and shouting prices. Bumpy spoke quietly, calmly, like a professor delivering a lecture. "Friday night, you called me a monkey. You threatened me with arrest. You humiliated a woman I care about and men who work with me. You did this because you believed your position protected you. You believed that I was powerless. You were wrong." Calabrese said, "Madden will kill you for this." Bumpy shook his head. Madden is a businessman. He understands cost-benefit analysis. By the time your body is found, he will have calculated that protecting you costs more than letting you go. 7 people are dead or destroyed because of what you said Friday night. You are the 7th. Madden will recognize this was proportional, not excessive. He will take the lesson and move on. Calabresi was sweating now, his face pale. Please, I have children. I was just doing my job. Bumpy's expression did not change. You were not doing your job. Your job is to control access to a nightclub, not to degrade human beings for entertainment. You made a choice. Choices have consequences. This is yours. Bumpy removed his jacket, folded it carefully, and placed it on a chair. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew a blackjack, a small leather-wrapped weapon weighted with lead shot. Calabresi tried to stand, to run, but Bumpy moved faster. The first strike was to Calabresi's temple, controlled and precise, designed to disorient but not immediately kill. Calabresi fell sideways off the chair. Bumpy struck again and again, each blow calculated. This was not rage. This was execution. When it was finished, Vincent Calabresi lay motionless on Angela Romano's kitchen floor. Bumpy checked for a pulse. There was none. He put on his jacket, smoothed his hair, and left the apartment through the same back entrance Angela had used. He walked 3 blocks to where Junie Bird waited in a car. They drove north to Harlem in silence. Vincent Calabresi's body was discovered at 2:30 Wednesday afternoon, when Angela's neighbor heard flies buzzing and smelled something wrong. Police arrived. An investigation opened. Angela Romano, when questioned, claimed she had been at her mother's house all morning and knew nothing. No witnesses placed anyone at the scene. The official conclusion: organized crime killing, motive unknown. Only Madden, when informed, made one phone call to his contacts in Harlem. The message that came back was clear. This matter is closed. By Thursday morning, the full scope of what had happened became apparent. 7 men connected to the Cotton Club had died or been destroyed in 72 hours. The deaths appeared unconnected to authorities, but formed an obvious pattern to those in the underworld. Word spread through Harlem, Little Italy, and beyond. Bumpy Johnson had responded to an insult with surgical precision. He had demonstrated reach, patience, intelligence, and ruthlessness, and he had done it in a way that left only Madden no rational choice but to accept the outcome. The strategic brilliance of Bumpy's response was in its proportionality and messaging. He did not start a war with Madden. He did not attack the Cotton Club itself. He did not kill indiscriminately. Instead, he targeted 7 specific individuals, each of whom bore some responsibility for the insult or its context. Sal Torino, the creditor whose death destabilized Calabresi psychologically, the 2 cops who enabled the Cotton Club's impunity, the 2 doormen who laughed, Eddie Malone, who supervised the security structure, and finally Calabresi himself. Each death or destruction served a purpose. Together, they formed a lesson. The community in Harlem responded with quiet approval. Bumpy had defended their dignity. He had shown that insults would not stand unanswered. The numbers racket's runners and customers remained loyal. Madame St. Clair, when informed of the operation, nodded once and said, "That's why he's my strategist." Only Madden, pragmatist that he was, took the lesson. The Cotton Club's door policy did not change. That would have required abandoning the segregation that made the club profitable to white audiences. But the doormen received new instructions. Be polite, be professional, avoid confrontation. Madden understood that Bumpy had demonstrated capability without declaring war. The smart response was to absorb the loss and avoid escalation. The 7 deaths became legend in Harlem. They were discussed in barbershops, pool halls, and churches. Some saw Bumpy as a protector. Others saw him as a necessary evil. But everyone saw him as a man who kept his word and defended his community. This was Bumpy's greatest strategic achievement. He had transformed a moment of humiliation into a demonstration of power that increased his standing with allies, commanded respect from enemies, and sent a message to everyone that dignity was non-negotiable. Documents declassified decades later revealed that the FBI had monitored the situation from a distance. Agents noted the deaths, recognized the pattern, and correctly identified Bumpy Johnson as the orchestrator, but they did not intervene. In the Bureau's calculation, black criminals killing white criminals in New York was a problem that solved itself. This institutional racism inadvertently gave Bumpy freedom to operate. He understood that authorities cared little about justice in Harlem and used that indifference to his advantage. The strategic principles demonstrated in these 72 hours would define Bumpy Johnson's career for the next 3 decades. First, information was power. Bumpy spent days gathering intelligence before acting, ensuring he understood his targets completely. Second, patience was strength. He did not react immediately but planned methodically. Third, precision was more effective than excess. 7 deaths sent a clearer message than 70 would have. Fourth, symbolism mattered. Each death carried meaning, and together they formed a narrative. Fifth, proportionality prevented escalation. Madden could accept 7 deaths in response to a serious insult, but would have retaliated against an all-out assault. Perhaps most importantly, Bumpy demonstrated the power of strategic theater. The 72-hour window, the number 7, the variety of methods, the careful selection of targets, all of this was designed to create a story that would be told and retold. Bumpy was not just punishing his enemies, he was teaching future enemies what happened when his code was violated. This was information warfare at its finest. Case file number 007 reveals a mind that thought in systems, not moments. Bumpy Johnson in June 1935 was 30 years old and still building his empire. He could have responded to Calabrese's insult with immediate violence and likely would have killed Calabrese within hours, but that would have been tactically successful and strategically foolish. It would have started a war with Madden, brought police attention, and failed to send the complex message Bumpy wanted to communicate. Instead, Bumpy orchestrated a response that addressed multiple audiences and objectives simultaneously. To the Cotton Club's organization, he demonstrated that racism would be punished. To his own community, he showed that dignity would be defended. To other criminal organizations, he proved his operational sophistication. To corrupt police, he revealed their vulnerability. To Oni Madden specifically, he showed respect for the broader power structure while drawing a firm line around what was acceptable. This kind of multi-layered strategic thinking is rare. It requires intelligence, patience, creativity, and the ability to manage complex operations across multiple domains simultaneously. Bumpy Johnson possessed all of these qualities. The 7 deaths of June 1935 were not his most famous operation. That distinction probably belongs to his later confrontations with the Italian mafia or his partnership with Malcolm X. But they represent Bumpy's strategic philosophy in its purest form. The question that remains, the question worth considering, is whether Bumpy's response was justified. From a legal perspective, obviously not. 7 people died or were destroyed because of one man's insult. No system of justice would sanction such a response. But Bumpy Johnson did not operate within a legal system that protected him or his community. The police, who should have arrested Calabrese for public harassment, instead took bribes to ignore it. The courts that should have provided recourse were closed to black citizens. The legitimate avenues of redress simply did not exist. In that context, Bumpy's response becomes something more complex than simple criminality. It becomes a form of community defense in the absence of institutional protection. This does not make it right, but it makes it comprehensible. When the social contract breaks down, when authorities protect oppressors instead of the oppressed, alternative systems of accountability emerge. Bumpy Johnson created such a system. It was violent, illegal, and morally ambiguous. It was also, in the context of Harlem in 1935, effective. The legacy of those 72 hours extended far beyond the immediate incident. For the next 3 decades, until his death in 1968, Bumpy Johnson operated with a reputation for strategic brilliance and proportional response. Rivals knew that attacking him would trigger calculated retaliation. Allies knew that loyalty would be rewarded and protected. The community knew that egregious insults to their collective dignity would not stand unanswered. This reputation became a form of power in itself. Bumpy did not need to resort to violence as frequently as less sophisticated criminals because his reputation preceded him. People understood the consequences of crossing certain lines and usually chose not to cross them. This is the ultimate achievement of strategic thinking, creating conditions where violence becomes unnecessary because the potential for violence is so well established and so clearly communicated that it serves as sufficient deterrent. Modern strategists in business, politics, and military affairs study concepts like deterrence theory, escalation management, and strategic signaling. Bumpy Johnson, with an 8th grade formal education and a library of books he taught himself to read, mastered these concepts through experience and application. He understood that power is not just about capability, but about the perception of capability and the willingness to use it. The 7 deaths also reveal something about Bumpy's code. He could be ruthless, but he was not arbitrary. Each target bore some responsibility for the initial offense or its enabling context. Bumpy did not kill Calabrese's wife or children, though he easily could have. He did not attack only Madden directly, though Madden ultimately profited from the system that employed Calabrese. Instead, Bumpy drew precise lines of accountability and punished only those who crossed them. This discipline prevented his operations from devolving into chaos and maintained his legitimacy within the community he protected. The historical record shows that after June 1935, the Cotton Club's doormen were notably more respectful to black visitors. The club itself remained segregated, but the overt hostility diminished. This was a small victory, perhaps, but meaningful to those who experienced it. Bumpy had changed behavior through strategic action. He had proven that even in a deeply racist system, boundaries could be established and enforced. What can we learn from case file number 007? First, that strategic thinking requires understanding systems, not just individuals. Bumpy did not just focus on Calabrese, he mapped the entire network that enabled and profited from the Cotton Club's racism and identified 7 points of leverage. Second, that effective operations require patience and intelligence gathering. Bumpy spent days collecting information before acting. Third, that proportionality is strategic, not moral. Bumpy chose 7 targets, not because 7 was morally correct, but because 7 sent the right message to multiple audiences. Fourth, that symbolism and narrative matter as much as material outcomes. The 72-hour window and the variety of methods created a story that amplified the impact of the deaths themselves. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, that strategic violence is communication. Every act of force sends messages to multiple recipients, and effective strategists craft those messages carefully. Bumpy Johnson was a master communicator. He spoke in the language of power, and he spoke clearly enough that everyone understood. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968, of a heart attack in a Harlem restaurant. He was 62 years old. He had spent more than 40 years in the criminal underworld, surviving wars with the Italian mafia, multiple prison sentences, and countless assassination attempts. He mentored Frank Lucas, befriended Malcolm X, and became a legend not because he was the most violent man in Harlem, but because he was the most strategic. The Cotton Club closed in 1940 after a series of financial problems and changing cultural tastes. Oney Madden retired to Hot Springs, Arkansas, and lived quietly until his death in 1965. The 7 men who died in June 1935 are largely forgotten, except in police files and Harlem folklore. But the principles Bumpy Johnson demonstrated in those 72 hours, intelligence over impulsiveness, strategy over strength, proportionality over excess, those principles endure. We study this case not to glorify violence, but to understand strategic thinking under pressure. We analyze Bumpy Johnson not as a hero, but as a case study in how power operates when institutional systems fail. We examine these events because they reveal truths about human nature, social systems, and the logic of conflict that remain relevant today. The question is not whether we approve of Bumpy's methods. The question is whether we understand them, whether we can extract the strategic lessons while rejecting the illegal applications, whether we can study the mind of a criminal genius without endorsing crime itself. This is the purpose of case file analysis, to learn from history even when that history is dark. Bumpy Johnson once told an associate, according to accounts preserved by those who knew him, violence is the last resort of the incompetent, but when it becomes necessary, it must be precise, proportional, and purposeful. Anything else is just murder. In June 1935, Bumpy Johnson was many things: strategist, criminal, protector, killer. But he was never incompetent. The 7 deaths that followed a racist insult proved that. For better or worse, that is his legacy. That is the code he lived by. That is why we remember his name.